Thus far, we have covered classical and neoclassical criminology. Now we are going to turn to the positivistic school of thought, where we will spend a considerable amount of time. As Miller and colleagues argue in their book, Criminological Theory, the positivistic school of thought has its roots in the scientific revolution of the 16th century. Cesare Lombroso, the founder of positivism, challenged Beccaria's notion that criminals were rational, self-interested individuals who were otherwise normal people. Rather, Lombroso argued that criminals were not normal and were biologically different from non-criminals. He used the term attativistic to describe these individuals as being genetically inferior. Lombroso developed this theory while working as a physician in an asylum. He conducted extensive examinations with criminals and non-criminals, and in 1876 developed a list of traits distinguishing the two. In Lombroso's work, The Criminal Man, he argued that 1 out of 3 of all criminals were born criminals and had qualities that resembled a caveman or a genetic throwback. These traits included long jaws, arms expanding greater than height, a flattened nose or excessive wrinkling, swollen lips, and a scanty beard, among other features. Interestingly, he later contended that environmental factors also played a role in crime. This is actually a fact that many people tend to overlook when they discuss the work of Lombroso. Still, Lombroso argued that biology led directly to crime. His theory was eventually abandoned and discredited. However, Lombroso's work helped lay the foundation for the positivistic school of criminology, which by and large contends that crime is due to forces beyond the individual's control, whether these be biological, psychological, or social forces. Also, another aspect of positivism is that social scientists rigorously evaluated theories using a scientific method. Positivism still dominates the field today. Throughout much of the remainder of the semester, we will be discussing several different theories which fall under the umbrella of positivism. Even though Lombroso's Criminal Man was discredited, biological theories of crime have gained a lot of prominence, especially in recent years. However, unlike Lombroso, most of these contemporary theorists contend that biology does not lead directly to crime. Rather, they contend that biology increases the likelihood that individuals will develop traits that are conducive to crime. Also, most contemporary biological theorists recognize that biology is influenced by the social environment. Let's turn to Ellis and Walsh's study, Gene-Based Evolutionary Theories in Criminality, which appears on page 43. This article first appeared in 1997 in the peer-reviewed journal Criminology, which is the flagship journal for the American Society of Criminology. In this groundbreaking article, the authors argue that under some conditions, individuals with negative traits might be able to produce these traits at higher rates. For example, Ellis and Walsh argue that genes which promote traits of pushiness and deception may produce at higher rates, passing through the genes. I'm actually very pleased that the authors included Ellis and Walsh's theory in their book. At the time this article was published, which was only about 15 years ago, there was a mixed reaction. As you read through the theory, it brings to mind repressive crime control policies such as the sterilization of inmates. The authors do not advocate this, but they do make some very interesting points that are worth our consideration. Remember, one of the main premises of this article is that certain genetically based traits conducive to crime may actually provide a reproductive advantage in some circumstances. Ellis and Walsh used gene-based evolutionary theories to look at specific types of crime, such as spousal abuse and child neglect, as well as general acts of criminal and antisocial behaviors. When the authors discuss rape and sexual assault, they assert that sexual aggression is naturally selected to be exhibited in the sex that invest the least in offspring. In virtually every species, that is the male, and the authors use the term cads to refer to males with particularly low investment in parenting. Using an evolutionary perspective, they argue that men are free of parenting responsibilities, so they biologically have more to gain by having multiple sex partners. And they will find partners perhaps from pushiness or force. This gene then gets passed on because it has a higher reproduction rate. And given this gene-based evolutionary perspective, the authors assert that it is no surprise that males commit more sexual assaults and rape than females. From the author's perspective, this is an example of evolution and is reflected in the fact that when rape occurs in other species, it is almost exclusively done by males. The authors argue that females have a natural tendency to resist rape, since this robs them of a meaningful opportunity to choose their partners. This, according to Ellis and Walsh, is because they want to find a man who will help them raise their offspring. In their discussion of sexual assault and rape, the authors even contend that in some societies, males who engage in acts of rape may actually out-reproduce males who only mate voluntarily with their sex partners. Also, they contend that rapists have more active sex lives, which incidentally is a finding that has generally been found to be true in related studies. Interestingly, the authors argue that societies penalize rape and make the penalties severe, and they contend that this is done in order to prevent genes which are conducive to rape from overtaking the population. As you can imagine, this would certainly be a problem. It could lead to an entire nation of overly aggressive, pushy people. Ellis and Walsh also discuss spousal abuse, and they contend that this is not solely a human phenomenon. They suggest that this behavior occurs in 4 other primate species where the male attacks females, especially a female who shows an interest in other males or may not be sexually receptive. And the authors also speculate that spousal abuse should be highest in human populations that have fewer stable marriages, greater promiscuous sexual intercourse, and more children who do not receive the name of their father. While the premise has not been fully tested, some scholars have supported this aspect of Ellis and Walsh's assertion. Other scholars argue that there is no scientific evidence to support this, so the jury is still out. The authors also provide numerous other hypotheses, all of which are grounded in gene-based evolutionary theories. One hypothesis is that parents who have more children than they have resources will more than likely abuse or neglect their children. There is at least some evidence that supports this hypothesis. Criminologists have found higher rates of abuse in larger and poorer families. Also, abuse is unusually common among never married, separated, or divorced families. Ellis and Walsh also argue that children who are less likely to reproduce are likely to disproportionately be victims of abuse, and this to a large degree is true. They also suggest that children will be more likely to be subjected to abuse when no close genetic relationship exists between the parent and the guardian. There is research which also supports this assertion. The authors argue that a gene-based evolutionary theory explains why some males may turn to crime in order to acquire material resources which will help them gain sexual access, which in turn will help them reproduce. And the authors also discuss differences between mating and parenting, and they refer to this as the RK continuum. This is a very important part of their theory, and it's worth examining probably in more detail than I can provide here. What I will say is that the authors argue that persons with the greatest tendencies towards criminal or antisocial behaviors should exhibit at least most of the traits that are associated with mating rather than parenting. Again, this is an area of the article that I suggest you pay close attention to and reread. The authors also discuss testosterone in males. Interestingly, and this is not in the article, there was a very recent study that was published only a few weeks ago which found that after a baby is born, the male's testosterone level decreases over time. Using the logic of Ellis and Walsh, perhaps this could be nature's way of helping to keep males at home and invested in their offspring. Again, this is only speculation on my part, but it would seem to coincide with Ellis and Walsh's theory. Now, I realize that some of you may be very critical of this theory, and some critics have even gone so far as to say this is a sophisticated version of Lombroso's work with little empirical support. In fact, I was somewhat surprised that Colin and Agnew included it in the 4th edition of their book. Still, it is worth discussing, although I may have spent a little more time on this than I should have. So go ahead and take a break, and then when you come back for round 2 of this week, we will continue our discussion of individual traits as well as the role that biology plays in crime.